Hello, everyone, and welcome to this SharePoint Online Introduction Training. My name is Scott Kinsella. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer and Microsoft Office Specialist Master. That is long titles, basically just to say that, well, I like to teach and I'm pretty good at Microsoft Office. At least I like to think so. Yeah, so I've been an MCT for about 11 years now, and I specialize in all of the Microsoft Office end user products. So I've been working with Microsoft Office and its related products since 1996, back when it was still Office 4.3. So I've been around that block numerous times. So I've been teaching and working with these products for well over 23 years. And currently I work for a company called Planet Technologies. We're a Microsoft partner based up in Germantown, Maryland, just kind of up the road from where I'm at now. And I spend most of my professional time working on government contracts and different sorts of things like that. But I also, when I do get the spare time, I like to offer classes to friends and coworkers and do these recordings also for YouTube to just help educate people. I like to get this stuff out there because I know and understand everyone struggles in trying to learn and work with all these products. For those of you that might be new to attending these live sessions, just ask you to keep your audio muted throughout the session today. And if you do have a question, please just type it into the chat window. And at the end of class, after we stop the recording, I will stick around and answer questions for as long as I need to. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you already know that there are, you already know my channel, and you already see there's other videos there. So please take some time to look at those. So in this class today with SharePoint Introduction, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Doing a SharePoint intro is always really hard because there's just a lot of things in SharePoint that need to be covered. Back in the day when I could do these classes longer, we used to take 3 hours to teach a SharePoint intro. And over time, it's like we have less and less time to do that because people's attention spans are a lot shorter. So I've managed to get it down to 90 minutes, but it's basically going to break up into 2 sections. In the first kind of 45-ish minutes of this class, I want to spend a lot of time on the fundamentals of what is SharePoint, what is its structure, and how do we navigate? I mean, these are all important things. Too many intro classes I see out there just kind of throw you into the whole environment and you still don't really know what it is and how to get around. So I think it's important to spend a good chunk of time on that. And then in the second half, the second 45 minutes of this session, we're going to spend time looking at what I call or are called the SharePoint content categories. And that is the information that we have and that we put out on SharePoint goes into one of 3 buckets. And these buckets are pages, lists, and libraries. And what we want to do in this session is understand what those buckets are. So that's our rough agenda for this session for today. A lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. So first off, even after all of these years of SharePoint being out there and being a product, there's still a lot of people that don't know or understand what it is. And I think that's fair. There's still, it's hard to believe, but there's just people that don't know what it is. For now, and for our purposes in this session, we're really going to talk about SharePoint Online as opposed to SharePoint on premises, and we'll talk more about those differences as we go along. So when we're talking about SharePoint Online, that product is part of the Office 365 suite. So depending on whether you've got a home subscription or a commercial subscription or a government subscription, it's very likely, especially in the commercial and the government space, that you're going to have also with the licenses for OneDrive and all the other Office applications, you'll also have access to SharePoint. Whether you have that as a home user kind of depends on the package that you buy. Most of the packages for home folks don't include SharePoint because generally you're not trying to collaborate with other users. But from just a whole software standpoint, it's part of the Office 365 suite of products. As a matter of fact, also, I probably need to update this presentation because Microsoft is moving to calling this Microsoft 365 instead of just Office 365. So I'll have to update that. So why this why are we emphasizing SharePoint Online versus on premises? Well, generally, if you've worked with SharePoint before, maybe you've heard of SharePoint 2010 or SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint 2016 with that whole year moniker attached to the name SharePoint. Generally, excuse me, when you hear that, you're hearing about an installation of SharePoint that is maintained by your company or your government institution. They have a local server or something, and they run SharePoint from there. Like many products and services nowadays, SharePoint is moving to the cloud or is moving online. And Microsoft has been offering this SharePoint Online for several years now. And what that does is by moving SharePoint to the cloud and letting Microsoft manage the updates and security upgrades and all that sort of business, we no longer need a year moniker to define SharePoint because basically they're updating SharePoint frequently, okay? So now it's just called SharePoint Online. We don't have a year or number on it because it's, SharePoint 2019 and now it's SharePoint 2020 in April version. It's just they're putting out updates and upgrades all the time to the SharePoint environment. So we don't have a version number per se on SharePoint anymore because just like the apps on your phone, automatically update themselves and they're always current, we have the same situation with Office 365, Microsoft 365, and SharePoint. So still, okay, we got that part out of the way. Well, what is SharePoint? Well, look, what the product is and does is in its name. It's a place where you share stuff, or a point online where you share content. That's basically what it boils down to at its most fundamental. Here's a long definition. It's a web-based document and content management system that allow users to blah, blah, blah. Look, y'all can read the slide. But it does boil down to that, is that SharePoint is a web-based application that does a lot. That's why it is kind of hard to define with one small thing. But at its fundamentals, it's a site that we can go to. It's an application, it's a program, however you want to look at it, but it runs in the web browser, and it's a place where we can go to share content with other users very seamlessly, as opposed to the old clunky methods of emailing things or having network shares and so on and so forth. SharePoint does have a lot of purposes out there in the world. You'll see a lot of companies use it for portals and intranets and extranets. Used to be used for standard websites, but they've really gotten away from that. They've really gotten away from the whole public-facing aspect of SharePoint. So again, I probably need to update this slide and remove standard websites. But if you've worked with SharePoint at your company or business or government, this is exactly what it's used for, is that you probably have a portal or an intranet or something where you're using SharePoint to host or manage that content. This slide has a very, very key statement that's going to be important for the rest of this session, and that's this. SharePoint Online has many content and process features, circle that, put a star by it, that enable us to share, discover, organize, and manage information, or basically do all the things that are in this slide, and they're pointing down to the slide, that are on there. But I think the key statement here is not all these fun little adjectives, but rather content and process features, okay? Content features are the things that hold the content, okay? Process features are the things that do stuff to that content, and that's an important distinguishment. I know that's not a real world, but that's important dichotomy setup that we need to be aware of. How does this translate into SharePoint? Well, everything in SharePoint, for the most part, can be put in one of two categories. It's either some type of content feature, so that feature exists to manage or hold content, or it is some sort of process feature that is intended to do things to the content that we have there, okay? Everything, there are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, everything in SharePoint breaks down into these two categories. It's either a thing that holds things, or it's a thing that does stuff to the things that are being held by things, right? Very technical. In this introduction, we're just concerned about the content features because that's the cart, right? Or I'm sorry, that's the horse. We got to have the horse before we have the cart. So we need to understand where are the types of buckets, or what are the kinds of buckets that we have in SharePoint that we can put content into. And then we can talk later about, okay, what can we do to all that content in those buckets? We'll see a little bit of process features today, but the main goal in this intro class is to really get a good understanding of the content features, okay? If I've got content or I've got information, where do I put it? And it goes into one of three kinds of buckets: a library, a list, or pages. Now, these come in lots of varieties and types, and I can't possibly get to all of them in one class today. So the main, again, so even within the content features, the goal is going to be recognizing what's a library, recognizing what's a list, recognizing what's a page, even though they come in lots of types. Once you've got that part down, then we can deal with process features later. So that's the goal of our introduction today, is really get familiar with those buckets, those content features for organizing our information on SharePoint. Look, SharePoint is highly customizable, and this is both the great thing about SharePoint and the difficult thing about SharePoint. You know, I've been teaching these Office products for years, and you know, it's easy to teach Word and it's easy to teach Excel, in the sense that no matter where I would go in the world, or even if you're watching this, you know, wherever you'd be in the world, if I was teaching a Word class or an Excel class, I could pretty much guarantee we're all looking at the same thing. Sure, there's some different versions out there, but for the most part, Excel is Excel is Excel, and Word is Word is Word, and that makes things easy. Where SharePoint gets to be really difficult is that it is highly customizable. It's like a box of Legos that we can, okay, here are all the basic building units, and you can do whatever you want with them. So that makes SharePoint sometimes difficult to teach and understand, because you know, maybe the SharePoint that you're working with at your government agency or your business has been highly customized for you and might look nothing like the stuff that I show you today. And that makes things tricky. And even at the same company or in the same business, you may have lots of different sites and lots of different SharePoint instances, and they may all look completely different from each other. And I, and that's difficult. But that's also the great thing about SharePoint. It is highly customizable. We can make it do the things that we want to, so that it meets the needs of our organization, as opposed to a one size fits all. So depending on the template of the site that you start out with, and lots of different things, so many, you know, there's a lot of factors there. You may have a basic site that just has, you know, a page and one list and a couple of libraries, who knows, or it may be a lot more customized than that. So keep that in mind as we go through this session and go through this training, that I'm going to show you basic stuff, but your mileage may vary, you know, your experience may vary once you get out there into the real world and start working with SharePoint. There's going to be a lot of variation out there. And even right now, you know, I don't know when you're watching this training, maybe 6 months, maybe you're watching this 6 months after I've recorded it, and there may be new features, there may be different things about SharePoint, which means I'd probably have to re-record this. But point being, that's just the nature of the beast these days. So to sum up this first section, look, SharePoint Online is a highly customizable and flexible solution for managing content, documents, and information. And our goal in this session is to really understand those content buckets. So let's talk about those Legos. Let's talk about, all right, you've got SharePoint sites. How are they built? What are the main building blocks of this SharePoint stuff we've got? Well, first off, at the highest level of organization, we need to understand that there are three basic organizational units to the higher level things in SharePoint. And these terms are site collection, site, and subsite. These are our first three organizational terms we need to understand about how SharePoint is put together. Always keep in mind, even with this diagram that I've got on the screen, what you experience may be simpler, or what you may experience may be more complicated. And again, it always comes back to the Lego analogy. I think there's like what, billions of possibilities even with just 4 bricks of how they can be arranged. And we have that same idea here in SharePoint. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So first off, let's talk about what is a site collection. Well, the tricky thing about site collection is it actually kind of has 2 definitions. Site collection is the top level site and all of its subsites. So looking at this chart right here, it's a little bit, I kind of lied a little bit in this chart. The site collection really is everything that comes down from the top to the other sites, or in this case, left to right. This whole business is a site collection. But a site collection is also sometimes just the top level site. Technically, its name is the site collection site. That just gets even more confusing. So sometimes you just hear it called the site collection. So that's where the definition gets a little fudgy. So it could mean if somebody says the site collection, they might just be talking about this top level site. When they're talking about a site collection, they may also be talking about the top level plus anything that falls underneath that chart. That's just how it is out there in the business right now as far as that term. So yeah, here it is. What relates all of these things? Well, it really just comes down to the web browser URL, and we'll see an example of that shortly. And that there's going to be a base web address for the site collection, and each site and subsite below that just kind of tacks on to that address, and that's what relates them all together. So in a few minutes here, I'll show you how to recognize, is something on this site collection or on that site collection. Okay? So our next organizational term to be familiar with is, what's a site? Okay? So at this point, I like to start to use a house analogy for what sites are. Sites are like houses, okay? Some houses can be very simple and not have a lot of rooms in them, and some houses can be very complicated and have tons of rooms in them. But overall, that house is organized, or that site is organized around a common purpose or goal. Often a house is a place where a family lives, or maybe a single person lives, but there is some sort of common purpose or goal to that house, okay? Let's just use the family analogy. Everybody lives in that house because they're all related. Sites are the same way. We have these sites, and they're there because they're there for a common goal or purpose, like a department or a task or a project or something along those lines. Some sort of common purpose or goal is that site. And those sites themselves, once we get in there, once we walk into that house, well, now again, what your experience is once you get to a site, or how that is constructed, can vary greatly, right? Just like in the real world where there are millions and infinite possibilities for houses, we have the same sort of thing in SharePoint. We can't really say a site is always this, okay? Because it's just not that way. Sure, you can buy a house or put on a site, and it may have certain decorations and apps and things already in it. That's definitely the way SharePoint can work. But just like in the real world where I can buy a house and it's a ranch style or Victorian or whatever, and come with certain things, we can always modify it to meet whatever we need. Or maybe it just has nothing at all, right? House flipping, we just cleared the whole thing out. But overall, the site is the common purpose or goal. You could have a project site, a meeting site. There's just tons of examples here that I just put a few on this slide. So now let's get into subsites. And here's again where things get a little fudgy, because technically speaking, all subsites are just sites. There's really no difference between a site and a subsite. They're the same thing. The only thing that makes something a subsite is that it's got a parent or a site above it. And that's where I kind of already lied again with this diagram. It's just kind of hard to do that. Yes, I have site collection up here at the top, and then below that, I've got these things called sites. The reality is, even this level right here are technically subsites, okay? What defines something as a subsite really just is based on where are you standing in relationship to the overall hierarchy. Okay, if I'm up here at the top level site collection, everything below me is a subsite. If I'm standing right here, okay, the two sites below me are subsites, but then the one above me, well, that's a parent site. The analogy here is just like parents and children, okay? Any one of us can be both a parent and a child depending on where you're standing in things, right? I am definitely a child. I have parents, and so in that case, I'm a child. If I had children, in that case, I would be the parent and there'd be children underneath me. It's the same thing here in SharePoint. The only thing that makes something a subsite is there's a parent. And what relates the site to the subsite? It's the URL. It's just the web address. And again, we'll see an example of this shortly. And even this diagram is, again, oversimplified. You can have additional more and more subsites. That's not as common nowadays. You do see less numbers of subsites and more of the higher level stuff. That's for when we get into the intermediate and advanced things in SharePoint. We tend to see more site collections nowadays. Back in the day, it used to be, no, we only have one site collection and everything is going to be sites and subsites underneath that. Nowadays, Microsoft is much more, look, just make your site collections and have fewer subsites. And maybe it'll come back around later on. Just like children can inherit genes and looks and behaviors from their parents, subsites are the same way. That subsite may inherit its look and feel and navigation and permissions and everything else from its parent site, or maybe it looks nothing like them, right? You know, sometimes you get that one kid that just doesn't fit. You know, hey, the parents both have blonde hair and the kid has dark hair. It happens. The same thing can happen here in SharePoint. The subsite that we have here might not look anything like the parent site. That's definitely possible. Now, how do all of these things relate as far as web addresses? I've alluded to that a couple of times. When we're dealing with SharePoint Online, all SharePoint Online sites start off with something like this. There's going to be something right here as the first part, whatever your company or business or wherever you has registered as your username on Microsoft 365. But something like that's going to appear right here, and then it's going to be .sharepoint.com. That is your domain that you've got by way of your subscription. The next thing you'll see is the word sites. And then anything after the word sites is the next part in the chain. So that first word right here, that is the site collection. So in the case of what I've got, and I'm going to show you, I've got a site collection called demo. That is the name of the site collection. So that's the first thing that's going to appear after the word sites. Again, it gets a little fudgy going beyond that because we've got lists and libraries and other things that can happen. But to simplify it, if we were just looking at a base URL, the next slash after the word demo could potentially be a subsite to the demo site and so on and so forth, working our way down. Excuse me. So maybe I've got a subsite underneath demo called projects. And underneath the project site, I have another subsite called Windows 10, whatever. This is all how it works. They're all related by the URL. So if there was something else here, if this was sites and then projects, okay, that would be a different site collection. Okay, so if you've got a personal subscription, you'll have that here, and this will be the setup. Your work subscriptions can be the same way. There's going to be something here. It's going to be sites, and there's going to be everything else. If you're dealing with SharePoint sites that have anything else besides this, if it's not some sort of domain.sharepoint.com, maybe it's, www.cnn.com, SharePoint, maybe, I don't know, whatever your company is, then you're definitely dealing with an on-premises SharePoint. Okay? All right. So to review this section very quickly, our basic building block of our SharePoint stuff is a site. Those are houses. And a site should be organized around a common function, project, or team within our environment. So now let's talk navigation. Yay, finally we're gonna actually get into some SharePoint stuff. I know lots of theory here, but I think it's important. I very much believe that this stuff is important to just having an overall understanding. So when things are thrown in front of you, you can figure it out. All right, now is where things start to get a little more complicated when it comes to SharePoint, because Microsoft has been in this migration path on SharePoint for several years now. Unlike other applications where, they just kind of, like with Windows, when we went from Windows 7 to Windows 8 to Windows 8, Microsoft was like, hey, here's the new interface and you're stuck with it. And they realized, well, that was a bad idea. So then 8.1 came out. Still didn't work, but at least they did it quickly. And same thing with Office. When we went from Office 2003 to Office 2007, it was like, holy mackerel, we've got a ribbon and all these different things, but at least they went all in on it. Unfortunately, in SharePoint, Microsoft has been kind of piecemealing this transition of the old look to the new look. And they still allow people to use the old look for some things. So it's very possible within SharePoint to experience what's called the classic interface and the modern interface. There are both. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of these interfaces. And sometimes modern is great, but it lacks certain features. And in other times, classic is great, but it doesn't have things that modern does. So I'm going to go through both interfaces as we do stuff today, because it's very possible you'll run into both. So this is what makes my job as a trainer a little more difficult. So your site or what you work with, you could very well run into both of these types. So just be aware that that's definitely a possibility. So with that being said, what are the main components of our interfaces? Well, when we are working in SharePoint, there are essentially four main user interface elements that we can use to at least get around, right? How do we get around the house? How do we get around the neighborhood type deal here? And those things are the breadcrumb trail, the top link bar, the quick launch menu, and the site contents menu, okay? Before we go into these, I must reiterate, and I will keep doing this throughout the class, some of these things may look different. Some of them may not be present. There's just, again, the whole idea that SharePoint can be adapted and changed and customized is what makes my job as a trainer a little difficult. What I will show you today is if there is little to no modifications, but your mileage may vary when you get to wherever you work. Okay, so just be aware of that. All right, so first off, let me come over to a SharePoint site. So this is one of my SharePoint sites that I use for training purposes, and this is a what we would call a modern SharePoint site. It is using the modern interface. This is the top level site. So actually, if you look at the address up here to break that down like we did before, if you'll notice, it says consilla.sharepoint.com. So Consilla is my Office 365 domain, .sharepoint.com. Sites, and then this site is called demo-modern because I'm trying to use the modern interface as much as possible here. Okay. This page itself is also using the modern interface. On a top level site, you pretty much have to go with the modern interface. It is very, very difficult to switch to classic. However, sub-sites may have the classic interface. I don't have any sub-sites here, so I can't really show you the classic interface, at least as far as a home page. Oh, wait, I take that back. I do have a sub-site. We'll get to that. Okay. I did set one up. Sorry. All right, so let's first off get into the breadcrumb trail. I've still debated keeping this in here because the breadcrumb trail in a lot of ways is on its way out as a navigational element. It's much more present in the older versions of SharePoint. And basically what it was something that was up here that would go, okay, you're at this site, you're in this library, now you're in this folder, here's your view. It was this whole thing that went across the top, kind of showing you where you are, just like in Windows Explorer, where you've got that kind of path name. it's mostly on its way out. You'll find that, especially in the modern interfaces, it's really not there anymore. About the only place where you'll still find the breadcrumb trail in use is in a document library. And that's only if the document library has any sort of folders or things inside of there. And right now I don't even have any. Oh, I do have a folder here. So to show you in this library, right now you'll see it says I'm in in what I call the documents modern, because it's the documents library using the modern interface. And if I go into this folder labeled Hallie, you'll notice that now after the word documents modern, it actually says Hallie there. So this is the breadcrumb trail. So in the modern interface, it's going to start to build up along here about where I'm at in the hierarchy. If it was the classic interface, you'd see it up along the top. But again, about the only place where you're going to see this at all is in a library. We don't see it in lists, and on a lot of pages and other stuff nowadays, you don't see it like you used to. So it's on its way out. But I've included it in case it's still used with the stuff that you're seeing. So with that, let's move on now to the top link bar. So the top link bar, just like it sounds, is a bar across the top that has a bunch of links. That's really all it is. In a modern site, oops, let me get to my modern site. There we go. In a modern site, it would just be up here along the top. Okay. I don't have anything up there because, again, this is a really simple site. So even if I go into one of the libraries or lists, ooh, internet's really slow today. You would see stuff up along here if I had anything up there. I don't right now. Okay. It's basically just a set of links. Those links can go to anything. Okay. There really isn't any sort of limit or rules about if there are links up here where they can go. Okay. And again, in a modern site, they're just going to be up along this area right here in smaller print. Okay. They could be links to other sites. They could be links to subsites. They could be links to libraries. Again, your site designer can kind of do anything they want there. All right. So what about the quick launch menu, which is our next element? Well, the quick launch menu is this thing over here on the left-hand side, and it also is just a set of links. So that can be anything. So really, there's no difference whether links appear up across the top or whether they appear along the side. I will say this, SharePoint makes it a lot easier to work with and edit the ones that are over on the left than it is the ones across the top. But again, depending on what your site designer or owner has done, you may be using either or both. How that's being employed where you are, again, is really up to the site designer. And that can even differ from site to site. One person may not use the top level nav at all. Another site might only use top level nav. Another site may use both. Okay, so I wish I could say, well, these things on the side are always your lists and libraries, and the things up along the top are always that. That's not true. It can be anything. So this is a case where, again, your mileage may vary. What you experience at work or wherever you're working with SharePoint can be different. All right, and it can even be different at your job with all the different sites that you may experience. Overall, there's really no difference between stuff being listed here and stuff being listed across the top. It's just links to other stuff. And they can even be drop downs and flyout menus, just like we have on a toolbar. So you could have a menu up here at the top that you click and there's stuff listed there. That's also a possibility. I wish I had some better stuff for you there. All right. Now, overall, with the top link bar and the quick launch menu, there's something you need to know. If it exists on a site, it doesn't have to be listed, right? Back in the days of when landlines were much more available and used, back in my day, pretty much everyone had a landline, and they would almost always be listed in the phone book. But it was always possible, if you paid the extra money, to have an unlisted phone number. okay? In SharePoint, we can do the same thing. We can have components of SharePoint that aren't going to show up on the quick launch menu or the top navigation bar. Why? Maybe you don't use that aspect anymore. Maybe you don't use that feature and you don't want to delete it, but you also don't want people going in there all the time. So you can maybe just not list something. Oop, let me make sure I didn't mute myself. Sometimes I accidentally hit the button on the headset. You can't hide things on SharePoint completely. I will tell you that. There's no way to completely hide something. If you need to keep people out of something, just change the permissions. And we'll talk more about permissions here in a little bit. You know, it's just like in your house. If there's a room you don't want the kids to get into, you can't hide the fact that the room exists, but you can certainly lock it so they can't get in. Now, let's not talk about hidden rooms and blah, blah, blah. We all don't own medieval houses. But point being, from a simplicity standpoint, we can't hide things in SharePoint. We can limit their access. So what's the point? Well, maybe we don't have enough room. Maybe I don't want to list things here. Maybe I want to make it a little more difficult for somebody to locate something. Whatever the reason, the important thing to note is if it's not listed here and it's not listed up there, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Double negative. So how do we locate or find the things that aren't listed? Where is the place that I can go in SharePoint to see everything that's on a site? Because there has to be. You may find this in one of two places. The link to all of it may be here on the quick launch menu. You may see something called site contents. Now again, your site owner could delete that. They could get rid of that. If it's not here on this menu, you can go up to the gear symbol or the settings up in the nav bar. You can click that and you should see about a third of the way down, you should see something here that says site contents. And when I go to the site contents, this is the list of everything that's on SharePoint. You can't get rid of this. It's going to be there, okay? And this is going to list everything that's there. Okay, so as you can see on my site, there's a few things that aren't listed on these menus. Now, most of these things that are here are background things that SharePoint creates anyways, so it's not like I'm trying to hide them from anybody. They just normally don't appear on the menus because that's just how the way SharePoint works. Now, I could list them. I could say that the site assets library should show up over here. I don't really need to do that, but I could. So that's just how it goes. There's also a tab here called subsites because maybe I have some subsites. And in this case, I do have a classic I do have a site that is a subsite that's a classic site. So let's pop over to that because we are going to need this. So here is the classic interface, and we're going to break this down a bit more when we get into the pages part of things shortly. So this is what a classic site looks like, for the most part, if it's not modified and if it would ever finish loading. Okay, so if you're on SharePoint and you're looking for something and it's not on the menu, what you want to do is go to site contents, and that's either going to be at the bottom of the quick launch or it's going to be up on the gear symbol or settings. Go to site contents and then go looking for it here. If you don't see it here, you're on the wrong site. That's all there is to it. You don't hide things in SharePoint. Okay, it's not really possible. We just limit access when we don't want people to get into things. So if you're looking for a list or a library or something and you can't find it here, very likely, oops, you're on the wrong site or subsite. So you need to go to the right one. Okay, all right. So to quickly summarize this section, we've got 4 basic elements for navigation: the breadcrumb trail, the top link bar, the quick launch menu, and the site contents menu. All of these may or may not be present, at least the first 3. The site contents is always there. You can't get rid of that thing. And that's where you'll find stuff if it's not listed on the menus. All right. So now it's time to get into the second half of this class today, of this session, and really get into the content categories. The first part of what we've done here, yes, was a lot of baseline setting and getting ourselves in terminology and kind of really understanding our way around SharePoint. Now, in the second half of what we're going to do, now I want to get into those content categories because now we're ready we've got SharePoint, we kind of understand its structure, we know a little bit about how to get around. So now we've got all this content, we've got files and information and stuff, and we need to know where to put it, right? And those places that we can put stuff in SharePoint are what we call content categories, okay? There are variations within each of these, but there are three main buckets, and that is pages, lists, and libraries. Microsoft tries to call these apps. They try to make you think like SharePoint is just, an environment like your mobile phone where you just add lots of apps to do things. They're trying to sell SharePoint as that idea. I'm not exactly sold on it. I just don't think it makes sense in the SharePoint environment, but that's just me. You may disagree with me, and that's okay. But be aware that you're going to see that terminology used a lot in SharePoint Online of this idea of adding an app. It's like, no, we're just adding a room. Anyways, for the most part, any content that you have that you want to put on SharePoint goes onto some type of page, into some type of list, or in some type of library. In each of these three categories, there's lots of subtypes. In 90 minutes, I can't, or at this point, 45 minutes, I can't possibly teach you about every kind of page and every kind of list and every kind of library. But what I can teach you is, look, this is what pages generally look like and do. This is what lists generally look like and do. And here's what libraries generally look like and do. And now then, once we release you out into the wild of SharePoint for real, now you can go, oh, yeah, that's a type of list. I know what to do with those. Oh, hey, that's a kind of library. I know what to do with that. From this point on also, everything I tell you has an exception, and I know that. But if we went through the exceptions and things that don't fit in these categories and so on and so forth, we'd be here all day. I'm concerned about what's true 95% of the time. In advanced classes, okay, we'll get into the exceptions. But right now, it's just like when you're learning a language. When you learn a language, we learn the basic rules first, and then we get into the exceptions. So let's do the same thing here. So let's look at each of these categories by starting off with pages. That's the first one we want to look at. So pages generally are the first type of content that you encounter on a SharePoint site. I've said this in class, I've taught this class many, many times, and I still always say it. I always have a very tough time deciding, should we talk about pages first or should we talk about libraries? Because to be perfectly honest, a lot of people's first exposure to SharePoint is that somebody sends them a link to a file that's in a library, and that's the first time they experience SharePoint. So you'd think, hey, let's talk about libraries first. There's a good argument for that, but if we approach SharePoint the correct way, if we don't crawl into the house through the window, if we actually go through the house the right way, technically we're going to look at a page first. So that's why I like to talk about pages first. So generally speaking, if somebody sends you to a SharePoint site, then what you're going to see first is some sort of page. If I give you just the base address and say, hey, Joe, go to that site, you're going to be presented with a page, right? It's like if I tell you go to www.lego.com, you're going to be presented with some sort of page. And SharePoint is no different. If I tell you or give you a link to a SharePoint site, generally speaking, the first sort of thing you're going to see is some sort of home page. All right? So with that being said, what are pages? Well, you're going to laugh at this definition, but basically pages display content and information. And that's kind of a, well, no, duh, I'm going to see information there. All right, we'll dive into it a little bit more as we go along here. But let's think about it. The stuff on a page, first off, it's not files, all right? We don't have Word documents and Excel documents scattered all over a page. That's not how it works. We also, generally speaking, don't have little tables or lists or other sort of stuff there. I mean, we can, but we'll talk more about that. Generally, the page is the framework for organized information. I don't know how else to explain it until we get in there. It'll make more sense. And just like pages on the internet, what's actually really important in context of SharePoint pages is to understand this. Some of what you see on the page exists as part of the page, and some of the content you see is information that's somewhere else, and we're seeing a little capture or a window of that information. This will make more sense as we go along. All right. How does this all work in context of a page? Well, we have things called web parts. Let's jump back to a page to see what we're talking about here. So let me come back to my demo modern site. And the first thing, if I was to direct you to this site, is that you would see some sort of page. If I gave you this address to my demo modern site, then what you would see is this opening page, if it ever is going to come up. Come on, chug away. Of course, Internet Explorer not responding. I'm asking it to do too much. I'm trying to do this online seminar and video and do this, like my computer's a little bit old. All right, here we go. Now it's rendering the page. All right, so we go to this site and lots of content loads. There's going to be a bunch of stuff here. The stuff that's here may be stuff that's part of the page itself, or it might be information that's coming from somewhere else, okay, as we look at this. And if you look here, there's a graphic here, there's a news section, there's some quick links, there's an activity section, there's also this document section. So what we've got here is a mix of things that are right on the page itself and information that's coming from somewhere else. Pages are built of something called web parts. And here is where the Lego analogy can be taken again, or can be used, is that when we create a page, you can grab little blocks and say, I want this here and I want this here. Just like in Word or Excel, if I do create a page, there's generally some sort of template that's got certain blocks on there already for me, and I can customize that. I can add fewer or more depending on what I need, and SharePoint's no different. So in the context of SharePoint, when we have this page that's there, you theoretically could start off with one completely blank and build it, or you can start off with one that exists and adapt it. And after we get that framework page, the next level down is those web parts. How do I want to design that page? I take web parts and I just place them on the page how I want them and have them display information. The web parts fall into one of two basic categories. It's either a web part that displays whatever information I put into it, or it's a web part that's getting its information from somewhere else and it's displaying it on the page. Okay? Where am I at with this? So, looking here, some of these, like this news web part, there's nothing in there yet, but here's a graphic. You don't really think of that picture as a web part, but it is. I had to put the web part there that says, put a graphic here, and then I loaded the graphic into the web part. So this little picture right here is actually part of the page. This quick links section is something that's actually part of the page. That's just a default element that came up. But this documents section over here on the right is also a web part, but this information that I'm seeing here is coming from another location. It's coming from a document library. So when I look here, these documents don't exist on the page itself. The documents, this cookbook, this employee list, this bank account spreadsheet, those actually reside somewhere else in SharePoint, but they're being displayed here like a little window. Or another way I like to think of these web parts is like little wormholes, right? In a wormhole in the theory idea of in Star Trek or Star Wars space, whatever. I think it's Star Trek though. Star Wars, I don't know if you use wormholes. Regardless, the idea of a wormhole is that it connects two different points in space. You can go in it and come out it, and you end up in two different places. And that analogy kind of works here in SharePoint. When I look at this documents web part, this information doesn't live here. What I'm looking at is something that's over there, but it's being displayed here so I can see it. That's what that web part is. So web parts can get their information from other places, which means they might look different, okay? Depending on what's happening in this documents library, this list may look different every day, depending on how much activity is going on in that library. But you know what? This graphic right here isn't going to change unless I change it. It's going to stay the same, all right? So now that we've got that part down, that we know that web parts can exist in one of two parts, the next thing to understand about a web part is this, is that web parts still do, yes, act like wormholes, at least the ones that are showing me information from other places. If it's a web part that is connecting to other information somewhere else in SharePoint, you're going to see that by looking at the heading of the web part, and there's going to be a little thing here that says see all. Okay, so for instance, this news web part and this quick links, if you notice, those web parts don't have see all links. There's nothing there. So this information exists right here in the page. But if you look at the activity web part and the documents web part, those have see all links. So what that tells me is this web part is showing information that actually resides somewhere else. So I could click that see all and be transported, another space analogy, to where that actually is. So if I click see all right here, I'm going to now be transported to the document library where all of those files actually exist. Here we go. There's the library. This is where the files actually are. They're not on the page. We can see them on the page, but they live here, okay? Now on a classic site, the same thing happens, but it's not as obvious how to get there. If you happen to see a classic site and you don't see the see all links, on the classic sites, the way to find out if it's a link is you actually have to hover over the title, and if it turns into a hyperlink, you can click it. So like this news feed, that's a hyperlink. The documents, that's a hyperlink. I haven't done anything here, so there aren't any ones that aren't. So the trick on a classic site is you actually have to hover over the title to find out whether it's a clickable one or not. That's one thing I like about the modern pages, is in a modern page, there's no question. If it's clickable, there's a see all. If it's not clickable, it's not there. Easy, okay? All right, so while that's loading. So you can access the information in a web part by clicking either its heading if it's a classic site, or on a modern site, it's just going to say see all. That's just a quick summary of pages. So maybe I didn't, there's no way to define a page other than pages display content. When I've got a page, just really think of them like a home page. When you go to a home page for any site, there's all kinds of information that's going to be listed there. What you're not really going to have in a page is files. You might see files, but that's a web part where the files are actually somewhere else. And we've got this kind of Lego system of organized areas on a page. Maybe there's only one web part. Maybe you're going to go to a page and all you're going to see is a list of files. And that's where things really get confusing is, am I in a library or am I on a page with just one web part that happens to be showing a library? The dead giveaway is always, if you see a heading and it says see all, you're looking at a web part. You're going to want to go to the actual library. Okay. Pages generally are made up of web parts. Yes, there are exceptions. We'll deal with that in another class. And our web parts fall into one of two categories. They either display content that I entered directly into the web part on the page, or it's a type of web part that's showing information from somewhere else. In the context of an introduction, that's about all we're going to say about pages, because we don't make pages at introduction levels. Getting into designing pages and putting on the web parts and configuring them is all advanced level stuff. So most of the time, even at an introduction level or even an intermediate level, you're not going to be designing pages or constructing them or doing anything along those lines. You'll interact with the content, like you'll click on stuff, but that's about it. So I think that's what we just need to understand is, look, a page, and they don't have to be a home page. There can be other informational pages. We'll talk about that in the intermediate level. But that's our thing for pages, okay? All right, so let's move on to the next type of bucket that we have in SharePoint, and that is what we call a list. Now you're like, why aren't we talking about libraries yet? I got my reasons. So let's talk lists. Lists are data or information repositories in SharePoint. Now again, that sounds like an odd definition, but it will make sense as we go along. Basically, the list is structured or organized information that resides or lives right in SharePoint. Does that make sense? Fine. It didn't? Great. Let me make it easy for you. Lists don't store files. That's how it basically breaks down. The next two buckets, lists and libraries, again, are big ones where we store information. But if I wanted to make it really, really simple for you, libraries are where we put files, lists are where we put structured information, and pages are the ones where we put a little bit more unstructured information, like informational paragraphs and other sort of stuff. That's making it as basic as possible. So lists are not where we store files. We store structured information. And really, to look at them, you're going to look at a list and go, wow, that looks like an Excel spreadsheet. And you know what? You're not really wrong. Lists, as we look at them and interact with them, you're going to see that in a lot of ways, it looks like an Excel spreadsheet with columns and rows. That's really what it is it kind of looks like Excel right inside of your browser. It's not Excel though, keep that in mind. That's very important. It's going to look like Excel and maybe do certain things like Excel, but it is not Excel. Okay, keep that in mind. That's very important. What's also important, we're not dealing with files. Okay, we'll deal with files in the next section. Lists do have a lot in common with Excel, and in the lists class that I'm going to do, in this case right now, I'm doing on Friday. This happens to be a Wednesday when I'm recording this, but who knows when you're watching this. But in 2 days, we're going to do the lists class, the list basics class, easy for me to say. So we'll dive into more about this whole relationship with Excel. Your information you may have may look better on a list than an Excel spreadsheet. Anyways, let's talk a bit more about lists and then go into one. Of the 3 categories between lists, pages, lists, and libraries, lists have the most variation amongst them, okay? Almost all libraries really look the same. And as a matter of fact, as we're going to see, while there are 8 basic types of libraries, we generally only use one of them. And pages, there's lots of different designs, but really at their heart, there's only 2 kinds. Well, maybe 3, okay? Lists, however, come in lots of varieties. But fundamentally, they're all still the same thing. They're structured information that could be column headings and rows and so on and so forth, and it's not files. So when you look at this list of possible lists like calendars and contacts and announcements and tasks, you may be scratching your head going, those are all lists? But when you really think about it, all of these types of lists are structured information, right? Even a calendar is nothing but a list of dates, times, subjects, and so on and so forth that you could organize into columns and rows. As a matter of fact, if you may have even accidentally in Outlook accidentally turned your calendar into a table. It's possible. There's one of the views in there that you can do that. Okay? In SharePoint, you can use one of the built-in lists or you can customize them. And if none of those suit your needs, you can always make your own. This is no different than Word or Excel in general. I can either start from a blank document or I can start from one of the myriad templates that exist. In SharePoint, it's the same way. If I want to add lists to my site, I want to customize my house with rooms, I can use prefabricated things or I can use ones that I make myself. Either is acceptable. Fundamentally, though, a list is a list is a list. It's all information structured into columns and rows. One more thing before we get in there, and this applies even to pages, but much more so in lists and libraries. What you can do in a particular list depends on your permissions or what's been granted to you. And that can vary from list to library to list, even within the same site. A full discussion of permissions is well beyond the scope of an introduction class, but you should quickly need to understand this. There are different levels of access that you can be given to everything. So again, using that house analogy, you might have keys to get into the house, but you can't touch anything. That's very possible. You might have keys to the house or the site and only be able to get into certain rooms. And even within the rooms that you can get into, maybe some of those rooms you can only go in there and look, and other ones you can actually go in and make changes. And we have the same situation here in SharePoint, is that there's some things you're going to be able to do and some not, and it's going to vary from thing to thing. That's about all I have time to say about that. Let's get into working with the list. So let's look at a list. So I've got a list here, and I'm going to bring these lists up into, I want to show you both the classic and the modern. So let's bring up a classic list. I'm sorry, let's bring up a modern list. So here is a list in modern view. Really slow today. Okay. And I don't even have a lot of things open. That's annoying. And I am going to also open up the classic list here in another tab so we can compare. And let's close that tab. So what I've got here are two lists with basically the same data. They are separate, but one of them I said use the modern interface, and the other one I said use the classic interface so you can see the difference. Oops, I want the context classic. There we go. All right, so here is the same list. This is the classic. If I was using the classic interface, here is the modern interface. If you've used OneDrive or other sorts of things in Office 365, what you'll see is that the modern interface of SharePoint really makes SharePoint look like OneDrive or other apps that are in Office 365. The classic interface makes SharePoint look like your old version of Office, like Office 2010 or Office 2013. That's really the quick way to be able to tell the difference between them. But in the case, regardless of the interface, if you look here, everything is organized into nice, neat columns and rows. So I've got labeled columns, and the information just falls into line in rows after that. So looking at this, you see that this does look like an Excel spreadsheet, but it's not Excel. This information lives directly here in SharePoint. It just happens to be organized like Excel. Same thing over here. It looks a little bit different, but the reality is we've got columns across the top, and we've got nice, neat, organized rows of information that fall below that. There are no files here. There's no Excel file, but it does kind of look like that. So it kind of quacks like Excel and looks like Excel, but it's not Excel. Unlike ducks, where if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. All right. All right, so what are some of the things that we can do here in the list? Now, some of these things that we can do don't require any special permissions, and some of them don't. Some of them require, and some of them, what you can do depends on your permissions. I just got myself all twisted around there. So let's cover the things that you can do that anyone can do regardless of their permissions. So first off, let's talk about viewing the items. The first thing to understand next about all the data that's here is that you might not be seeing all of the data. Okay, some lists, when you look at them, may only have a few columns, so it's easy to see everything. But other lists may have lots and lots of columns, and that's kind of inconvenient to view all of them at once in SharePoint. So what often SharePoint does is that by default or at start, it only displays a few of the columns. When we get into the more advanced stuff, I'll show you how you can set up which columns are displayed. You create something called a view, but let's go with the defaults here. So looking at this contacts list, you'll see that right now I can see 6 columns here. Same thing over here, it doesn't matter. This is the default for a contact list, is it shows 6 columns of information. The reality is there's actually 17 columns here. So how do we get to the rest of the information that's here? Well, what you do is that when you hover over the first column item, so when I go to the first item in the column here, if I click that hyperlink, I'll be able to see something that displays the rest of the information. In the modern view, the way this works is that a panel slides out from the right, and now I can scroll down and see all of the information. So again, looking here, you can see there are 17 different columns here. In the classic view, if I click on something, it actually navigates to a whole new page and shows me everything here. So it's kind of similar, but in this case, I've lost the view of the original list, and now I'm on a whole other page. When I'm done looking at this, though, I can just click close, and it will take me back to the list. So that might be a lot of navigation back and forth. So what Modern does now is, rather than confusing you and sending you through lots of pages, when you click on an item, it just slides out from the side and you can see all of the information that's there, okay? Anybody can do this. You don't need any special permissions to see the stuff that's there, okay? So click on the first item link to display the item's details. Next, without any special permissions, you can sort and filter the information that's there. This is always done regardless of whether it's classic or modern. You do this through the column heading. Again, a few slightly different steps, but basically if I want to sort, if I want different sorts on the last name, I can just click the last name drop down, okay? And I can sort by A to Z, or if I want to apply a filter, I can select this filter by, and a panel is going to come out from the side. Now, last name is not a good field to filter by, so let's close that. Let's filter by company. That's a better one to do. So let me click on company here and say filter by. And what you'll do is you'll get a panel on the side that gives all of the options, and then I can select what I want. And that seems to really be chugging along today. All right, well, what should happen here, I don't feel like waiting for it, is a list of all the options, and then I pick what I want, and then it filters. I do not know why that's not loading. All right, well, let's come over here to see a similar thing in Classic. In Classic, if I want to sort, again, click the drop down and choose ascending and descending. The advantage, one thing Classic does have an advantage on is filtering, is that I can do it right from the drop down. So in the case here, the filters show up right on the drop down. So I could say only show me anybody from NCOM and close that, and look, I applied the filter right away. In the modern view, it wants to build a panel on the side, and you can see that because of my internet connection, apparently it's not the greatest today, it was kind of choking on generating that. So this is actually, you know, as I mentioned way earlier, some things are better about modern and some things are still better on classic. My opinion, you can disagree with me, classic still does filters better. I think it just gets them faster. I don't have to go through an extra step here, but hey, what do I know? So let me clear that filter. Clear the filter and close that. And let me try one more time over here, see if it chokes on that. Let's do filter by. And nope, seems to be choking on it again. Not sure what's going on there. Let me just do a reload just for fun and see if we can get that to cooperate. If not, we'll move on. Of course, things like this never want to work when I'm actually trying to do this live and for a recording. If I was not recording this, this would be perfect, but you know, welcome to my world as a trainer. All right, let's try one more time. Click the drop down. Let's do filter by. Nope, it's not having it today. Okay, sorry about that. The way it would show up is you'd have the pane over there, you'd have checkboxes, and just select your checkbox and apply the filter. Okay. Now, these three things that I just showed you can be done by anybody. It doesn't require any special permissions. From here on, it does require permissions. If I want to create new items, here's a button right here. I could say create a new one. I could click new, creates the, on the modern view, it slides out a new panel and I can create a new item. In Classic, right here, again, there's just a button. I could say new item, but also like in Classic, it's going to navigate to a different page. It's going to navigate to a different page. There we go. And I could fill out and create that record from here, and it would be added to the list. I don't feel like doing that right now, okay? So I can create new items. Now, if you don't have permission to do that, it's either gonna be grayed out or you'll click it and just nothing will happen, okay? So we can create new items. You can also modify stuff. In modern view, what's kind of interesting is that you can both view and edit right from the same spot. So even when I'm viewing an item, I can actually, if I've got the rights, I can actually right from just the view, I can come in here and click on fields and edit. So this is really a cool new feature of modern view, is that while you're viewing stuff, you can also edit right from there. In Classic, it's not as smooth. You do have to go through a couple of steps to edit stuff. First off, there's a couple of ways to do this, but basically they involve the same amount of clicks, is that I need to display the record. All right, so I can look at it here, and then I would need to click Edit Item, which takes me to a very similar page, but now I can edit stuff. So you do have to go a couple extra clicks over in Classic. So that's another win for Modern, is that Modern makes it easier to edit the stuff that's there. But in either case, as far as creating new or editing stuff, if you don't have the permissions to do that, you're not going to be able to do it. It's as simple as that. Okay? Lists don't always display all of the available data and items. As we already talked about, there might be more columns that are there. Now, if you've got somebody who's done their homework and done the work for you, you can actually create something called a view to automatically display certain other columns and configurations. This is a whole other class, but just to show you very quickly, in Modern View, if I click the up here next to the filter symbol, if I click the drop down here, I can select it in either from the top or the middle section here. I can select different ways to view the information. Now, the ones up here are built in. The ones in the middle are ones that I've created. There's always a default, and then you can create others. So I've got a view here called Phones. And what that's going to do is it's going to display, I said, display the first two columns and then any phone numbers. So that's a view I created. Here's another one called Business. And that view displays just the business information, like their job title, company, business phone, email. In another class or another recording, we'll go into how all these things are created. At a basic level, if your list owner has created them, they'll be listed here in the Modern interface. In Classic, if they've been created for you, they're going to be listed here. So they're a bit more exposed. They're right above the column headings here. So again, I could click on this one called Phones, and that views that shows my information a different way over here in this list. Okay? All right. There is a ton that we can do about lists, and in the list basics class, we'll get into a lot more of it. But here in the intro class, here are the key takeaways from this section. Lists are our organized information and data repository. Basically, we don't store files there. We store organized column and information that's organized into columns and rows that kind of looks like Excel, but is not Excel. It's just right there in a nice basic structure. So things are presented that way. These lists do have a lot in common with Excel, like our ability to sort and filter and edit and create new stuff. But as you'll see in other sessions, you'll see it doesn't have the mathematics capabilities and so on and so forth. All lists, no matter what, fundamentally are what we looked at today. They are some sort of column structure and row structure to store that information. It might have a different interface, like a calendar, right? A calendar doesn't look that way, but when you think about a calendar, it is just organized columns and rows. A task list is the same way. A survey is the same way. A discussion board, they're all, even though they might have different interfaces, they're all types of lists. So now, if you're in SharePoint and you're like, well, I need to put this information somewhere, if you need a structured place to put information, it's probably going to need to go into a list. And again, think like that Excel spreadsheet where you're like, yeah, we've got all that information that's just in an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe we could put that in a list, especially if it doesn't have any mathematics involved. All right, we got to move on. As much as I want to talk about each one of these, which is what the other classes are for, we got to move on to libraries. Because really, yes, as I said earlier, often the way people are exposed to SharePoint is the sneaky method by somebody in your office put something up on SharePoint and they pasted a link into an email or something and said, here, Joe, click on this and there's a file for you to work on. Libraries are the place in SharePoint where we store files. That is their basic main function, okay? Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and so on and so forth, those all get stored in libraries. And that kind of makes a library like the network, right? If you've got an H drive or an S drive or any of those sorts of things, that's how SharePoint libraries are the same. What makes SharePoint libraries different are all of the process features, right? We talked way earlier today about content and process features. And this is where libraries are so much better than networks. Because look, on a network or even on your own hard drive, you can put the file there, but that's it. It's just file storage. That's all you can really do with the file. But in SharePoint, we have lots of things that we can do when files are in a library. We've got version controls, major, minor versioning. We've got check in and check out. We've got content approval. We have workflows. We've got sharing and collaboration tools. There's all of these process features that we, that we have in SharePoint that allows us to do so much more with our files. And that'll be tomorrow's class. Tomorrow we're doing the library basics class, and then 2 days from now we're going to do the list basics. Or if you're watching these online, you can just take them all in one day. All right. Libraries in SharePoint do have a lot of advantages over traditional file storage and sharing options. Now, I would love to go on a soapbox for 90 minutes about this, but I will do that some in the library basics class. The reality is what makes the difference? It's the process features. It's that, via email or things on my network drive, there's not a lot of things that I can do there that we can do in SharePoint, and that's where SharePoint really does excel. Not excel the program, just to make sure clear here. Now, just like lists, libraries do come in a multitude of types. But I'm going to make it very simple for you. The reality is that even though there's about 8 different types of libraries, unlike lists, where we do see a great variety of them floating around on SharePoint sites, the reality is almost all libraries are based off of the document library. Now, like lists, document libraries can be customized. We can create custom columns and set it up custom ways. But fundamentally, they all look like libraries. So that does make our lives a little bit easier here when we are discussing libraries, okay? Basically, if you go into something in SharePoint and there's a lot of files listed there and it kind of looks like Windows Explorer, you're in a library for the most part. Just like before with lists, the things that you can do, your permissions matter. I'm not going to rehash this again extendedly, but basically, look, sometimes you're going to be able to go into that library and look at the files and that's it. Sometimes you can go in and edit, change, add, update, do anything you want. It's going to vary from library to library. So let's take a look at a library, both in classic and in modern view. So let's bring each one up there. That one's going to be the classic and this tab is going to be modern. And let's bring up the modern one here, Documents Modern. Regardless though, both of these are going to look like Windows Explorer. Just like when you go into Windows Explorer on your computer and you see things listed a certain way and it kind of, you can tell it's files, we have the same thing here in SharePoint, is that I see any folders listed first, and then I see an A to Z list of files. Now, that's if there's been no modifications or views or other things implemented. There again, you can do groupings and all kinds of fun stuff. But if nothing has changed, if it's just the basic library, you're going to have folders A to Z, files A to Z. That's just how it goes. Same thing over here. Look, I've got one folder and a bunch of files. That's how they're all listed. So first off, it kind of looks like Windows Explorer. There are lots of ways to get files up into a library, okay? We'll go through more of those in the library basics class, but at this level, the easy one to know is, look, you want to get something in a library, you upload it. It's that easy. Regardless of whether it's classic or modern, there is a button right here clearly labeled upload. Okay, and I can just do that and say I want to upload files, and then I would get a box open up and I would pick the files that I want to upload, okay? Or come over here, same deal, upload, okay? I get a slightly different interface, but basically now again, pick my file, I click browse, the file I want to upload is picked from here, and I just pick my files and upload them. That's all there is to it. The main thing to remember, though, about uploading into a library is that you're making a copy of the file. okay? Regardless of the method used, and again, in the library basics class, we'll go into all of the methods, but a key thing to remember with an upload is that you are making a copy of the file. So if it was on my H drive or my C drive or wherever, and I'm uploading it to SharePoint, the original stays where it was, and now I've got a new copy up on SharePoint. And the reason I want to emphasize that if you're the one doing the uploading is make sure that once you've uploaded that you know which one you're going to edit later. Don't accidentally edit the one that's still on your H drive and everybody else is editing the one that's on SharePoint, and then later on you discover, oops, I've been editing the wrong file, and now you've got to somehow reconcile the two different files. So just be aware of that when it comes to uploading, okay? All right, the next thing we need to talk about when dealing with files in SharePoint is this, is that when you click a file, oops, this is the preview. Oh, no, it is here. Okay, when you click a file in SharePoint, one of two things is going to happen. And this, again, depends on how things are configured. Either the file is going to open up into something called Office Online, or the file is going to open up into the related Office desktop application. This is not a function of the interface, whether it's classic or modern. This is a different setting, okay? Your administrator, your library owner can use the modern interface. That's one setting, but then how a file opens is a different setting. I will tell you this, the default is in the modern interface to open up into Office Online. That's the default, but it's possible to change that. Overall, I need you to understand two things. The interface doesn't matter as far as what's going to happen when you click something. Secondly, what was the second point I was going to make? Oh, secondly, you can't tell by looking when you get in there. Doesn't matter if it's classic or modern. When you click something, you're at the wheel. Now, I'll show you how to get around that. Now, what are we talking about here? So here is a modern library, and I'm going to go ahead and open up this cookbook document. This is a modern library, but I have no idea what's actually going to happen. Is it going to open into desktop or is it going to open into online? Who knows? All right, now I do know because I set this up, but I'm going to click the document and it's opening in the browser. Okay. Okay, great, we know that. Now, just to prove my point, let's go to the classic library and do the same thing, all right? Did I just close too many tabs? I just closed too many tabs. All right, let's reopen that in a new tab. All right, let's go to classic and watch what happens. So I'm going to select a document, I'm going to click it, and oh, looks like this. Classic view, it also opened up into online. So in this case, I've got these two libraries configured to open up into Word Online. Now I'm going to let this finish loading here because there's something I want to now talk about next. So in the case of, okay, I click on a document and it opens up into online. All right, well, I don't want to work in Office Online. I want to work in the regular desktop program. How do I get to regular desktop? Well, in all of the online apps, there's a little option right here that says open in desktop. So if I click open in desktop, now that file is going to be opened up into the regular desktop version of Word. Okay, so it's going to take a few moments to do that. As you can see here, I'm running the most current version of Office 365 Pro Plus. And there we go. Okay, file has opened up this way. Now, this could have happened when I clicked the file. I could have very well configured the library to go directly here, but it's not. So one of two things could happen. You could end up in regular Word, or you could end up in Word Online. The nice thing is, there are two nice things. Number one, even if you end up in online, you can always jump to the desktop application. So if you end up in Word Online or Excel Online or PowerPoint Online, there's always an option here that says Open in Desktop App, right? It's right here. The other thing is that there's a way around online if you know that's what's going to happen. So let me come over to Modern just to show. So as I already mentioned earlier, the default in this library is when I click something, it's going to open up into online, and I know that. but there's a way around that. So let's say I'm like, okay, I know if I click this, it's going to go to Word Online, but I'd like to skip Word Online and go directly to desktop. So what I can do here is instead of clicking the name of the file, I am going to select it by clicking just to the left. My ribbon changes up here, and notice now there's a menu up here that says Open. I'm going to click the drop down of that menu, and now I'm going to have two options, one that says Open in Browser and the other one that says Open in App. Browser is the online, app is desktop. So if I say Open in App, now instead of opening up online, it goes directly to desktop. Yay! Okay, there we go. So I saved myself a few clicks and a little bit of time knowing that little trick. How do we do that in Classic? It's very similar. In Classic View, let me come back over here to Classic, and let's go back here to our library. Okay. In Classic, it's very similar. Don't click the name of the file, click the selection checkbox next to it. So that step is the same. Where it's different here is this. You're actually going to go up to the Files tab, and there's no Open command, so you're going to click just Edit Document, okay? And that is going to take you right to the desktop application. So in this case, look, again, I skip past online, and I'm going directly to the desktop app, okay? So while you can't control what may happen when you click, because that's set by the person that owns the library, do know you have a little bit of control once you kind of know the tricks. There's only one case where you really can't decide, and that is if somebody has sent you a hyperlink in an email. Okay, by its nature, because you're being sent a hyperlink and because that's going to open up in a web browser, you're always going to end up in Word Online or the online app. So if somebody takes this file and they send you a link to it in your email, there's no way in the link to say open in browser, open in app, because you're just getting a web link, and so it's just going to automatically open in the browser. So that's the one time you can't get around that. Otherwise, though, when you are working in SharePoint, realize that regardless of the default, you can get from one to the other if you want, okay, with these tricks. Remember also, though, that the setting for desktop versus online is a different setting than modern versus classic. The modern versus classic design here is one setting, how files open is another setting. So all of that is here in the PowerPoint. You can read through these. I've gone through all this stuff. I'll let them go for a couple of seconds here, so we've got it for the recording. I don't have time to talk about folders, so let's summarize this section before we kind of start to wrap things up. So quickly, libraries are our file repositories. They are where we put Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, basically anything that's a file. In some ways, libraries are similar to the Windows or network because it's a place to put stuff. But in other ways, it's different because we have all the process features. There's lots of ways to get files into a library, generally upload. And lastly, be aware that when you click on any file in a library to work on it, you may end up in Office Online or Office Desktop. Okay? All right, there's a review section here in the handout. For those of you watching this on YouTube, hopefully eventually there's going to be a link in the description where you can download this presentation. So right now, all this review section is, though, is I just took every summary slide from the presentation and just stuck it here at the end. So you have a little handy guide if you wanted to print out these slides or whatever to review everything. So I'm just going to go through these slide by slide, a little slow. You can pause and look at these in the recording. I want to wrap things up here, though, and talking about some additional help. So you need more training? Well, first off, hey, you can always go to Microsoft's support site at support.office.com. That's actually their site for kind of all things Microsoft products. So please take a look at that. Just click on the SharePoint icon. If you're a bit more tech-minded and you want to dive into some of the more techie things about SharePoint, go to docs.microsoft.com, and there is a wealth of technical information introduction on not just SharePoint, but lots and lots of Microsoft products. So if you are a bit more nerdy minded or tech minded or really want to dive into certain things, you can take a look there. Obviously, for myself, if you're watching this recording, you've already found my YouTube channel, and you can see that I've got a variety of videos and free trainings out there that I encourage you to watch, share. I'm not making any money off of this. Look, I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart because I like to share this information and make it possible for people to be more functional with these products. If you happen to be on Facebook, you can also join my Facebook group called the Beardy MCT. Obviously, I'm an MCT and I'm fairly beardy. So you can go there, join the group. It's a public group, and that is the way I've been publicizing all of the trainings that I'm doing. You'll see event invites and more information on that Facebook group, and that's how you can find out what trainings and things are coming up. So for those of you that are watching this online, I'm going to wrap this up. For those of you that are attending the session here live, we'll do some Q&A here in just a moment. But overall, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you've learned something new about SharePoint. I hope you can be more functional in SharePoint, and I hope to see you in a future training.